Hey everyone, so it's time for another duck chess analysis video, and this one is a game between probably the two best duck chess players out there, or at least some of the top few, Kapik1337 and DragonB70. And there are only a few games between these two, but this was a really good, really exciting one. It's 5-4, so still some opportunities to maybe look for improvements, but these are very strong players, so I mostly just try to figure out what they're doing instead of trying to figure out what they could be doing better. Alright, so I guess I will get right to it. So we've got a fairly standard opening. I think Kapik likes to do this e4, f4 kind of thing, and then Dragon B70 is going for double fianchetto. And the double fianchetto idea is bishops are not normally seen as that good in duck chess, but I guess if you got both bishops looking along both diagonals in different colors, you can only block one of them with the duck at once. So depending on the flavor of the center, you might end up with one good bishop out of the two, which is often more than I get in my games. So seems reasonable. But one thing that I did wonder about this knight f3 at e6 move, I wonder whether that duck should have gone to g7 instead. Not a big deal, but just slowing black's development a little bit because e6 or e5, definitely not e5, but e6 doesn't feel like that natural of a move when g6 has already been played. So putting the duck at g7 would sort of force that compared to putting it at e6, which I feel like is not that critical of a square at the moment. But not a major mistake at all. G7 was going to come eventually, most likely. It doesn't seem like putting the duck on g7 forever would have been good strategy. So yeah, quite reasonable. So now white starts developing, but white constantly has to keep in mind this long diagonal where the bishop is attacking this knight. And this kind of becomes a problem for white. Black ends up being able to strike at the center. So you kind of wonder, is there anything that white could have done instead? You don't really want to put the knight on a3, and the d2 pawn's always blocked, so you don't want to put it on, or you can't put it on d2 either. So it kind of had to go on c3, but it's annoying that it has to do so. So I'll have to kind of think about this dynamic. I don't often have the double fianchetto played against me. I tend to play a bit more like Kapik, getting the knights out and trying to take the center. So I need to think about how to play against those two bishops. Okay, anyway, so black does start pushing a little bit on e6, and I think this is now to prep d5 rather than e6 for its own sake. Like you could think of e6 as a development for the dark bishop, but dark squared bishop isn't on that diagonal anymore. Continuing with some normal developing moves, and white played a3 here. I was a little surprised by that. It seems a bit slow to me. I wonder if it makes more sense to play b3 and get the bishop out, or maybe even b4. But a3 could be preparing b4 potentially. And really, this isn't the kind of position where there's anything that white really needs to do urgently. So maybe it's fine to play a little slowly, take away a potential square. But really, b4, I don't know that that's likely to become an important square in this position. I mean, getting a bishop to b4, that's a lot of rerouting, and getting a knight to b4 doesn't seem like it does that much. So yeah, this move, maybe I would look for something different, but to be honest, I don't have any great suggestions. Like changing the center, you can't push the d-pawn because it's blocked, and pushing the e-pawn, well then this bishop gets to look at this knight, so it's not really that much of an improvement. This is probably fine. So in developing, white starts to bring the queen out via an alternative route since the d or c pawns aren't moving anytime soon. And black starts to take space in the center. And there's really not much that white can do about this, given the bishop looking at this knight on the diagonal, unless white chooses to allow the bishop for knight trade, which honestly could have made sense, allowing this bishop out a little bit more cleanly. But I'm not too sure. I've seen Kapik do that in other games, actually allow that bishop takes knight trade. In another game against DragonB70 when I was looking through a game to do an analysis video on. But opted not to in this one, and I can certainly see the logic in trying to keep the knight on the board, but it did hamper white's development. So queen h4, I'm not sure what specifically the aim is here, but maybe just generally clearing out the back rank and getting the queen to a square where it has some potential in the future, maybe a kingside attack. And then d5, so it would have been nice to be able to stop this as white, but I don't think there was any way to do so. So now black's development looks pretty natural, and black has pretty big foothold on the center as well, I'd say. I've got both central pawns pushed, so in my opinion, the opening has gone quite well for black. And yet I can't point to any major mistake made by white. Maybe the double fianchetto is just really good, or maybe it's necessary to be willing to give up the knight for the bishop every once in a while. Oh, and I did think that maybe the duck should go on e5 instead. Not so sure, but it seems like white gets to play d3 if they want to, but the bishop doesn't have that great of a future anyway. And white could move the light squared bishop along the diagonal, but there's just nowhere to go. b5, you're just asking it to get trapped. d3, that bishop is just a big pawn. So maybe at e5 would have prevented white from playing e5 on the next move. So, might have been worth considering, but at any rate, this turned out okay for black regardless, I think. So maybe black was okay with allowing white to play e5. I did wonder if white should put the duck on d4 to prevent the d4 break. That does allow black to get knight f5. And knight f5 has to come with duck on this diagonal to protect the queen. For example, if duck d1, then just with the queen. So duck would have to go on the diagonal. Then white could retreat to here, block d4, and then the position is kind of stopped up. White can keep putting the duck on d4 if they want to, and black can keep putting it on d3 to slow the development of this bishop. It's a bit of a slow game. But white opted to permit that d4 move and stop knight f5, which makes a much more active and tense game, and a pretty exciting one, in my opinion. So we've got d4, duck e4, just preventing knight e4 and then duck along this diagonal, which would have nice d6 square to look at. And white retreats to d1. There's really no good square to suggest here. d1 is maybe the best of some bad options. b5, I did actually think about, like, what if knight b5 at d6 to try to play knight d6 next move, but then black plays knight f5. And then that knight has the d6 square, so this white knight has nowhere to go at this point. If black ever kicks it, then knight d6, the knight and queen are looking at it, we'll do knight trade, and then that pawn will become a weakness, or the queen will pick it up. So yeah, I think white made the right decision not to play that way. But knight d1, that's just kind of painful. And then black had the option to take on f3, but chose not to, which I think was probably a wise choice. So if bishop takes f3, and then duck at d3, for example, then bishop takes here, and suddenly black has to start putting the duck on the diagonal because it's going to take a long time to get that rook untangled. White could put the duck on, I don't know, maybe c6 or something, and then, I don't know, black maybe would put the knight on d7, keep ducking d3 most likely. Then white gets to start developing while black figures out the situation on the diagonal. So I think it was wise of white to omit bishop takes f3, and also white found a really nice move that I wouldn't have considered, actually. I don't think I would have spotted this, but bishop e4 at d3. It's an indirect attack on the c2 pawn. White's going to have to move the duck, so bishop takes c2 could come. And if white plays c3, then white will have to move the duck away from d3, which would then allow d3, trapping the e2 bishop. So white can't play c3, and there aren't many ways for white to defend the pawn. White could play knight e1 and defend the pawn, but this is almost humiliating. It stinks to put all these pieces back on the back rank. Maybe it's survivable. I was thinking that white has a few places to try to untangle. White could try bishop f3 at some point, b3 at some point, d3 at some point, and the duck can only block so much. So I think white could untangle, but you hate to be 11 moves into the game with white and have a position like this, all your pieces on the back rank, black's got a lot of space, and the pieces developed. So I think white made a choice that I think is a good decision. I don't know if it's objectively the right move, but I think it's a good decision to try to prove that what you've done so far is, it makes some kind of sense. Not that Kapik's play didn't make sense, but it ends up looking kind of rough if you have to play knight e1. So I think playing knight f2 is like a fighting spirit kind of move. So knight f2 at f5, and then that accepts that the bishop is going to take on c2. And white hopes to prove that this bishop is kind of in no man's land playing d3 in a bit. But I wanted to note this at g4 decision. So at g4, I think is intended to prevent white from playing g4. And the reason this is relevant is, like, say that black did this, then g4 would prevent the knight from coming to f5. So maybe we would see the duck coming here, and then the knight's two really, really natural developing squares of d5 and f5 are no longer available. So black would have to maybe develop this knight, maybe start to find a plan to extract this bishop. You'd love to play c4 at d3, but then knight takes d4 at d7 comes, so that doesn't work. So yeah, instead black blocks the g4 square, preparing knight f5 or knight d5. And I don't know whether f5 or d5 is better. f5 has the advantage of protecting d6, which is the square that white's knight is going to try to jump into soon. But knight d5 has the advantage of attacking the f4 pawn, so a bit of a trade-off there. And I did mention the possibility of bishop takes c4 at d3 just to secure a potential retreat for the bishop, depending on what white does, keeping white from playing d3. But I'm not sure that this is worth it. White could still try to keep the bishop locked in by putting the duck on e4 next move with a move like g4, duck e4. The bishop can't come there, pawn can't push because two attackers, one defender, queen doesn't count so far away, the duck will block it. So yeah, so maybe at d3 was worth playing, but I think at g4 is perfectly reasonable as well. And white tries to show that the bishop is stuck on a meaningless area of the board, and white tries to claim that this is compensation for the pawn. So black brings the bishop to a4. If black didn't move the bishop, then white might have some idea, like say just black does something like this, I don't know, then white could play knight e1 at b3, trapping the bishop. And you kind of have a similar thing if black puts the bishop on b3, then you start running into like knight d2 stuff at c4, and then the bishop has to go to a4 anyway. So I think the bishop is destined for a4 eventually, no matter what, so might as well get it over with and not let the knight reroute to d2, which is actually a pretty good square looking at c4 and e4. C4 is a little worse than e4, but it still eyes d6, so probably an okay square. Right, so bishop a4 at g4, still ensuring that f5 and d5 are available for the knight. And white brings the knight into e4, looking at the d6 square, and puts the duck on b5, keeping the bishop from retreating. Black brings the knight to the desired square, which both hits the queen and defends d6, so white's knight d6 is no longer much of a threat. Duck blocks the diagonal so that the queen at d8 is safe. And white evades the threat. I think h3 ends up being a good square when white starts to push some things on the king side, so at first I thought f2 might be better, but I think h3 is a good square for this. I develop the knight and keep white from kicking the f5 knight. Black develops the bishop, and then pretty monumental decision f6. So they say that pawns are the soul of chess, and I think this is even more true in duck chess. The duck can often blockade pawn breaks and things like that, so when you get a pawn break, often it might be your only chance to take it if you've got some tactical reason that the duck is elsewhere. So I really try to keep a close eye on pawn structure in duck chess. And this f6 move, I think it's a good idea. So one thing that you have to ask is when the pawns are looking at each other, should white just take it and put the duck I don't know, e7, but then I think bishop takes is a good move, so this bishop keeps this knight from improving. And on g7 it wasn't really doing anything it wasn't doing on f6. So I think this is a good score for the bishop, but now the rook potentially is opened up in the future as well. e6 is a little weak, but the bishop on f6 makes it hard for white to attack that. So something like bishop takes f6, duck g4, and I think black is pretty happy with how things have gone. So white decides to keep the attention, and I think this is probably wise. But there's no way to directly defend this pawn. Dark squared bishop can't do it, knight and queen can't do it, rooks can't do it. So white improves the rook marginally. I think it's hard to suggest a move for white here. I can't think of anything that really jumps out at me. Tough position. White plays rook a1 at b5, and then black plays f takes e5 at f6. And I should note that at f6 is important because e takes f5, and then duck anywhere, but the duck can't be on f6. And then black gets to take back. That's the key. So knight attacks, knight defends. Black is able to win the pawn. So at f6 is required for this capture to win the e5 pawn. But then that means the duck is tied down, and white gets to play a pretty nice counterattack starting with g4. This begins a really, really interesting sequence where both players had a lot of ideas that I think are smart, and that I wish I would have seen myself in the same situation, but I'm not sure I would have. But anyway, I think black could have afforded to prepare this a little bit more. Maybe even just something like queen e7 at g4 would improve black's position a little bit, and it's still hard to suggest a move for white. Maybe black was worried that white would take and felt that that was worse than the game continuation. But since white didn't take last move, I don't know that white would this move either. Maybe something like b4 at b5, but it's not too convincing. I think black would probably just ignore this and take on e5, so I can't suggest a good move for white here. In the game, black goes ahead and takes, puts duck in f6, and then white starts a really cool counter strike with g4 at h6. So at h6 takes a square away from the knight, which is pivotal because later on white wants the h file to be open, so that queen takes h7 checkmate is a threat. Black instead retreats the knight to e7, and note the duck still has to go into f6 for the e5 pawn to be won. So that means that white gets to bring a knight to g5. And white chooses the f knight. I kind of wondered about this knight instead, because the f knight was looking at e5, so this knight would leave the attack on e5 intact. Trying to remember the thought process though, because this knight that was on e4, it does look at d6, which is a nice square. And in this situation, maybe black can just play duck h4. So maybe this knight staying on f3 isn't actually that useful anymore anyway. So I think this knight fg5 does make sense eventually, since d6 is still available. And since I think e takes f4 would have come if this knight went to g5. But it's a really complicated position. I'd definitely welcome your thoughts on this, because I don't really know what to make of it. But you'll see what happens. It's pretty interesting and pretty complex. So knight d5, duck h4. Duck h4 prevents queen takes h7 checkmate, and note black no longer needs to put the duck on f6 because e5 is now adequately defended. Knight versus pawn, one attack, neither of them blockable by the duck. And black spent quite a lot of time on this move. I was looking for other candidate moves, things like rook f6. But then white probably just takes. Knight for rook, roughly an even trade. And then white plays this, preparing the g5 break. Queen's under attack, white gets to play g5. And f takes e5 may be coming, on which white's bishops will start to be pretty active, and the rook, so I kind of like this for white. I think it makes sense that black didn't go for this. Also, e takes f4, relieving the tension on that e5 pawn. then rook takes f4. And again, white feels pretty active. I don't know that black gained much out of this. Maybe something like e5 at h4. That's complicated. I don't know. I don't know what happens here. Maybe e5 at h4 would have been a good move in that situation. So maybe that's what black was considering taking here. But knight d5, I think that's a good move, and I don't think I'm qualified to say whether that's better or whether the other one I was looking at is better. Okay, so white goes ahead and takes, making use of the knight move to g5. This does release the threat on h7, but I think it makes sense to do this. The queen moves and puts the rook on d6 just to prevent knight d6, duck e7, which would have been potentially pretty strong. Queen would have to go to b8, and white's got a lot of space. I'm not sure if that's really good for white or if it's just a mirage, but what ends up happening in the game is this f5 move. So now f5 means that the knight is protected. Queen's no longer attacking it in a dangerous way. And also black is no longer threatening to take on f4. So I really like this f5 move, but I didn't quite understand the reason for e7. It might have been because of knight e7 striking at the f5 pawn, but I'm not sure. I don't think that black would have played that anyway, so I don't know. And black captures the f5 pawn, puts the duck on f4. I don't know if rook takes f5 was a threat yet. I wonder if the duck could have gone on f6 instead, because I think white, personally, I think white should have played g takes f5 at f6 instead of f7. So, at f7 it keeps the rook from taking the pawn, but it doesn't really matter. The queen and rook are both looking at it, so they can't both be blocked. So I don't think f7 is that meaningful of a square. A queen coming out on this diagonal doesn't work. Two pieces looking at h5. Queen f7 doesn't feel like it has much of a point to me. So at f7, I'm not sure what it does. I really would have preferred at f6 because of what happens next. So black goes ahead and brings the knight to f6. And this asks a question to this e4 knight of whether it wants to be traded, and also prepares a potential bishop d7 in the long run, unless it gets blocked. And for a while it's not clear whether bishop d7 will ever matter, but it actually does end up mattering. So I think it would have been good to block this knight 7 f6 move. Because what do you do with this white knight? It looks like it's better than this black knight. It's centralized, it's on an outpost. But if it gets traded, like if white just plays, I don't know exactly. I guess I had something in my notes, I think. Let's see. I'm not sure. Let's say white just brings the queen here. Actually, that might be good, because I was thinking if knight takes e4, duck anywhere, pawn takes e4, then black starts to get a protected passed pawn, which could be dangerous, but actually, with this queen f3 move, white could take back. So I guess black would want to put the duck on f6, actually. So knight e4, duck f6, queen e4. Maybe now the duck goes to f7 since queen h5 is an option at this point. Then this pawn is potentially under attack, so knight f6 isn't really an option. I think this could be okay for white. I hadn't thought about that move before. So yeah, generally I thought that this knight move kind of forced this knight to act, because knight takes, pawn takes, and these passed pawns run. But I don't see what happens against this queen f3 line. Well, let me know if you have any ideas. This seems decent for white, in my opinion. At least compared to what ended up happening. But white spent a solid 40 seconds on this one. And Kapik is definitely stronger than I am, so I might well be missing something. Anyway, this knight d6 move, it destines the knight to come to c4, and I don't think c4 is that great of a square for the knight. Queen e7, this was going to happen either queen e7 or queen b7, depending on where the duck went. And then it comes back to c4, and this hits the e4 pawn, or e5 pawn, but that sort of compels this e4 break to come, which I think is a pretty good break. So I don't think white necessarily wanted to cause this to happen. Right, so white goes ahead and captures, and this duck placement on e3 means that white kind of has to. Like if white does something else, say white wants to bring knight to e5, then black can play e3, either duck e1 if you're willing to trade the bishop for, yeah, duck e1 I think. Picking up the bishop for just a pawn, or well, even knight takes actually. So yeah, that at e3 move kind of forces the capture, which happened in the game. So he takes e4 at f3, and I like this at f3 placement because the bishop gets to go to f3 next move, and I think that's a nice square for the bishop. So now we got that bishop f3 move, and this diagonal is really juicy. You've got two knights and eventually a rook, so black's going to have to place the duck on this diagonal for quite some time. And white then ends up losing the bishop for a knight, which at first seems good for white, but actually black ends up doing pretty well because of some concrete lines that follow. So white recaptures and puts the duck on f6. I'm trying to remember why the duck goes to f6. What would have happened if duck b5? Oh, okay, was it? No, rook takes f5 doesn't work. Rook takes f5. You have to play duck g4 if you want to save rook from the queen, but then bishop takes knight. So it doesn't work. I'm actually not sure why duck f6 instead of duck b5. Might have missed bishop d7, which I think is a really nice move. This was sort of foreshadowed a long time ago, but this bishop comes to d7 and hits this knight. And if the knight moves, then this pawn behind it is under attack as well. And bishop is now much better activated than it was before. But yeah, I think duck on b5, I think I prefer that. I'll have to think about whether there's a really important reason for the duck to go to f6. Okay, so bishop d7 at e4. At e4 is going to keep coming to protect this d5 knight. And white moves the knight. And duck goes to f6, so that's just protecting the knight from queen takes g5. But you wonder if there's anything to do with knight takes f8. I think I'd love to follow this up with queen g4, but that kind of invites the knight e3 attack. So white could put the duck on e3. Then rook takes, queen g4, protect this pawn. But then after queen f6, you can't protect the pawn anymore, and this is starting to look pretty nice for black, in my opinion. You got the protected passed pawn, you got pretty active pieces compared to white, and f5 is going to fall. And so I can certainly understand why this wasn't played in the game, but knight g5 at f6 is tough as well, because now white gets to play queen e3, duck f2. So in duck chess, double attacks are not usually super effective because you can move one piece out of the attack and block the other attack with a duck, except for in some circumstances. But here we've got a triple attack. There's an attack on the king. If the king doesn't move, then white has to move the duck, and queen takes king is winning. but also the queen is attacking both knights. So normally this triple attack would be a massive problem for white, but white has a trick up their sleeve. Queen takes h7. So white can play king h1, duck f4. And if the queen takes on d2, then black will have to choose between duck e4, which is bad because queen takes h7 wins instantly, or duck on the h-file, which allows bishop takes d5, winning a knight back. So white found a tactical defense, really nice defense. But white sees this and continues to put the pressure on with h6. And now it's hard to figure out what to do as white here. This knight doesn't really have a good square. And also this knight is still under attack. So white hits the queen, which I think makes sense. And white's coming up with a lot of only moves here in time pressure. I was pretty impressed by this sequence. So queen's hitting the knight. And now we still have two knights under attack. No, queen takes c4 and duck at c3 or c2 would pick that up. So white saves the knight. And black takes. And note, black keeps putting the duck on e4, not only to stop bishop takes d5, but also to stop knight g e4, consolidating those knights. Then white jumps the knight in, and black's queen takes knight. Queen takes rook would normally be an option because the duck could block rook recapturing, but then bishop gets to take on d5. So if black did this, then white would just do that. So white only needs to worry about defending the d2 knight. It's a very complicated position. So bishop takes knight at e4. And white retakes, so note that black has got that knight back for the bishop, so now we've got equal minor pieces again. And black plays rook e8 at e4. This was a time pressure move. I think it makes sense because we've got two pieces on the diagonal. Might as well get one of them off, and it probably doesn't matter too much whether the knight or the rook come first. Might as well get the rook first so that e7 isn't an idea. Now, white's got to still deal with this knight. White opts with rook b1 at c2. Now queen c3. So this knight's still under attack. This pawn's under attack. This knight is preparing to come to safety. And I guess the most crucial issue is that this knight has nowhere good to go. And white goes with queen f5. Now the duck has to defend the queen, and then black plays knight e3, which is, I think, a fatal blow. So knight hits the queen hits the knight, no defense for both of them. And I think at this point, black plays a little extra flourish here. But at this point, I think black has winning material advantage. So could white have done something else here? I was thinking, not ideal, but white could try rook bd1 at e3, so rook defends the knight. And at e3 stops knight e3. So now black probably takes on, no, actually can't take on e6, or bishop takes d5. So black gotta move the knight. I guess knight f4. And I guess duck g4. So at this point, e6 pawn's gonna get picked up. Be queen g3. So at this point, black's got, what, 3 extra pawns? And white's still got some pieces that are imperiled a little bit, not too well defended, but I don't think white's that much less active than black at this point. So a 3-pawn disadvantage. I think white would lose this, but white can play on and have a lot of hope, I think, whereas with the knight loss, I'm not sure if there's that much hope left for white. Let's get the rook for bishop. So maybe I should have looked at that later section more just to see whether that rook for bishop gave some hope. But at any rate, I think it was all a time scramble at this point, so I'm probably thinking about this drastically more than either of them had the chance to think about it. Anyway, really, really interesting and nice and cool sequence here. Really everything starting from g4 way back when. It's like sharp, well thought out, cool, interesting to think about. So Yeah, I think what I want to do next actually is take a look at this in an engine. There's an engine out there called TJ Duck Chess, and I want to see if it has any ideas that I don't mention here that seem clearly better to my human eyes. I think it's better than me with a steady time control, but maybe correspondence I could still beat it. I'm not too sure. Well, anyway, hope you enjoyed, and please join the Duck Chess Discord if you're interested. And hopefully at some point I'll have a video of the engine's insights into this game, if there are any that I think are worth talking about. Well, thanks for watching, and that's Duck Chess Analysis number 2.